Hello, everyone, and good afternoon, and welcome on the second day of the second forum on environment and climate change, organized by Embrace the Earth. My name is Tunda Gekedi, and I'm part of the Embrace the Earth team, and I will be moderating this session. Our first presentation today is titled Cross-Border Responses to Wildlife Crime, the case of Totoaba trafficking in Mexico, the US, and China. And it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Sigrid Gutiérrez Aquino, a young emerging researcher with a background in international relations. She has presented her work at leading academic institutions in Mexico, volunteered with the Mexican Aliens Against Trafficking, and worked at Mexico's Federal Attorney's Office for Environmental Protection, engaging in cross-border cooperation with the United States and Canada. Currently, she is completing an internship at the Global Green Growth Institute, supporting the sustainable finance team in Mexico. Today, Sigrid will guide us through the complex challenges of illegal Totoaba trafficking, a lucrative but devastating wildlife crime that threatens biodiversity, fuels organized crime, and endangers the vaquita marina, the world's rarest marine mammal, with only around 6-8 individuals remaining in the wild. So thank you very much, Sigrid, for being here today, and you may now start your presentation.
Thank you. I'd like to start thanking Embrace the Earth for this opportunity. I've seen the work that they do, and it's very wide when it comes to environmental topics, but I think all of them are very important. So I'd like to share some important case with you today, which is actually my case study for dissertation. So I'm particularly passionate about this, and let's start. Okay, so first, if you can see, I prepared a brief introduction because this is not such common topic, but it's very interesting because of all of the things that interconnect. I mean, it's not just wildlife crime, but also a lot of social and economic problems leading to this trafficking. So illegal wildlife trafficking is a very generous business when it comes to the profits, because it generates over 20 billion US dollars annually, approximately. This estimate is very important, and it has been calculated by Interpol a few times, but of course it needs to be updated to really see how it's increasing over the time, and especially in these last few years. So this threatens biodiversity and fuels organized crime in Mexico, the US, and China. Totoaba is a critically endangered species from Mexico. It is original from the upper Gulf of California, and it's trafficked for its swim bladder, fetching up to $100,000 per kilo in Asia, which is the main consumer destination. This trade also endangers the vaquita, the world's most endangered marine mammal. It was mentioned in the introduction, there are very few specimens left, and there's annually studies on why it could be diminishing, and the main reason that has been identified is the Totoaba trafficking, and I'll explain why in a minute. But this is very important to mention because as it involves more than one country, even though these species are original from Mexico, the trilateral cooperation existing between the US and China is key to dismantling these networks for wildlife crime. So I like to just start first with the importance of international regimes, especially when it comes to biodiversity issues, because it's mainly talked about the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, and the CITES. So the CITES is more for regulating the trade of wildlife species, and this international biodiversity regime is built on cooperation through these frameworks. So these instruments are used to promote sustainable use, conservation, and shared responsibility among countries, but their effectiveness depends on the institutional capacities of each country to implement the conventions and enforcement efforts of each member state, because as we know, these conventions and in general, most of the environmental instruments are not forcefully legally binding. I mean, we have measures to implement these regulations on our national frameworks as well, but it's very hard to really achieve the goal when it comes to the limited capacities that the states can have, especially when it comes to human resources and also the problems trying to make it also like make sense with the national framework. And I mean, one of the main troubles here when it comes to the vaquita and the Totoaba is that there's a wide range of legal framework to regulate in the upper Gulf of California, for example. There has been established national protected area in that place, but there's also like restrictions to fisheries in multiple times of the years according to the reproduction cycle of the Totoaba and the vaquita. So the CITES Convention is which mainly deals with this issue of illegal trade, and Mexico has been very concerned trying to implement measures that the CITES Secretariat has been demanding of the past conference of the parties. But the convention on biological diversity is also very important in the sense that it not focuses on wildlife life, but also in biodiversity in general. So it does support the implementation of certain measures, and Mexico is trying to align with them as well. So, as I was mentioning, particularly on the CITES framework, it regulates the trade of endangered species through licensing and scientific oversight. And the Totoaba is listed in Appendix 1, so is the vaquita, prohibiting its commercial trade. However, enforcement relies heavily on national authorities, and CITES lacks coercive power, making coordination among countries essential but challenging. And here I'd like to specify something, which is that even though both species are listed on Appendix 1, which is the most restrictive appendix of the CITES, it prohibits commercial trade and also it puts a lot of measures because it's about species that are very hard to reproduce themselves, and it implies very careful attention from the authorities. But the Totoaba is a species that, yes, it is critically endangered, but at the same time, there has been a lot of research, a lot of scientific research to achieve reproduction, and it has been successful. So it's reproduced on some units, management units that are regulated by our Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources, and in those scientific process, it involves a whole market of the species to track that they come indeed from these management units for wildlife. So there's been a record on how to continue reproduction, and even though they get to reproduce species up to a young age, I mean, of course, they have eventually some complications when it comes to putting them back on the wild environment. But it's not a species that it's about to extinct, like is the case of the vaquita, which there have been some efforts to reproduce scientific with the vaquita, but it's not really working. So that's why Mexico is focusing a bit more on the extinction, on the possible extinction of the vaquita, because efforts have been unsuccessful in that sense. But the Totoaba has been able to be reproduced. So this is important because these management units have permits. Sometimes there's a research kind that focuses on studying reproduction, and there's also these units of management that have the capacity to sell part of these species that are being reproduced. I mean, in the case of the Totoaba, it is only possible to sell meat in Mexico. The swim bladder, which is subject to illegal trade, has to be destroyed according to our regulations. So that's a very strict very strict regulation that it absolutely has to be destroyed. It cannot be, not even the meat can be commerced internationally. So yes, it can be a bit more easy to continue with the regulations to take care of the Totoaba in that sense if we can continue to prevent illegal wildlife trade. With the vaquita, it's a bit more complex, but it definitely has to be uh, also addressed in the sense of reducing illegal wildlife in general of the species, because the upper Gulf of California is a very diverse region in biological terms. It has more than just the Totoaba as another critically endangered species subject to illegal trade. So even though this would be the main issue, the vaquita is also something that we have to protect and think about in relation to illegal trade. So the CITES implementation in Mexico, it includes several authorities. The CITES needs to have different kinds of authorities: an administrative or management authority, which in our case is the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources, an enforcement focal point, in our case is the Federal Attorney's Office for Environmental Protection, and a scientific authority. National Commission for the Knowledge and Use of Biodiversity is the designated authority for this role in Mexico. So these three authorities coordinate and interact between each other to implement the CITES regulations, particularly on their respective role, which can be a bit complicated because when we look at other countries trying to implement the CITES, it is hard as well, of course, but some countries have the particularity that their authorities, not always the three, but sometimes the three authorities are in the same agency. I mean, they're divisions within the same agency. In our case, it's not really like that. I mean, the Federal Attorney's Office for Environmental Protection and the National Commission for the Knowledge and Use of Biodiversity are the concentrated organs of the Ministry of Environment. So yes, it is within the same sector and part of the same agency, but not quite easy the coordination as if it was the three authorities just in as divisions of one agency. Each of them have their respective mandates, so it's a bit tricky sometimes with the legal competences on how to actually implement, because we have to remember that especially for illegal wildlife trafficking, it's not just the CITES authorities that are involved, but also law enforcement authorities regarding the National Guard and the Navy authorities. So, and of course, the part of um, yes, the customs. I forgot probably the word, but yeah. So it's a very tricky coordination when it comes to the competences in the upper Gulf of California to prevent illegal wildlife trade, because before recent years, it didn't really exist a clear document with established measures on how to act in the upper Gulf of California and defining each role. I mean, the authorities have been carrying out these kinds of tasks for multiple years in the past, but up until recently, the CITES requested an action plan for the vaquita and the Totoaba. So it had to be finally put in written the protocols of action that were supposed to follow by these authorities, especially the ones actually in the upper Gulf of California regulating trade and preventing measures. So, yeah, I like to also point out something that's important here, which is that the Totoaba and the Vaquita hold high ecological symbolic value. And while economic value dominates policy, concepts like ecological services and existence value highlight why their protection matters, particularly if we think that it's very complex to put a price on biodiversity. For saying somehow it's very hard to find all the reasons to make the importance of this, but when it comes to economic terms, when we know sometimes what really is at stake here is the cultural heritage that it's surrounding this species, because the upper Gulf of California has a very wide history. And I mean, the communities there also really value the vaquita, so they want to work all together with the authorities for the protection of the vaquita, but it becomes very hard to preserve this historical cultural value of the vaquita when also there are very restrictive measures applying to the fisheries in the region, which is the main economic activity for the communities. So it becomes complicated to try to collaborate with these communities in the protection of a very, very important species when it's also related to what they can actually do for a living. So I think it's a very important topic to reflect on how species possible extinction reveals this failure of current systems to make a match between the instrumental value and the intrinsic value. And that poses a threat actually to preserve life beyond market logic. So going a little bit deeper into the roles that each of these main countries play, Mexico, the US, and China, because I think I haven't made it very clear up until this point, but I'm about to. So the source country in this case is Mexico, as I was mentioning. The upper Gulf of California is a very important region for biodiversity and the origin of the Totoaba and the vaquita. While national regulations and enforcement zones exist, structural challenges such as poverty, corruption, and organized crime in the region hinder effective conservation species. Yeah, like I was mentioning, this region, the upper Gulf of California, has been very affected by the restrictive measures for fisheries. And also, it is important to mention that around 2012, 2013, Mexico had a very important increase of organized crime in the region for multiple reasons. I mean, historical, political, but this is important to this problematic because organized crime looks for very different sorts of products to traffic, not just drugs, not just guns, but also wildlife. I mean, there's a whole business that it's very profitable because it's less dangerous than other kinds of illegal trade, and it's good profit in the sense that uh, mm, sanctions for wildlife or environmental crimes in general, I would say, have this weakness that they can be lower sanctions than for other crimes. So if you look at the risk versus the possible profit, it has become a very lucrative market for organized crime, and especially in the region, yeah, in the upper Gulf of California, for its closeness with the United States. It faces a very important challenge in this sense. There have been a very wide presence of organized crime in the region, especially in the border. So if it's located in the same area as the problematic, which is the illegal trade of the vaquita of the Totoaba, I'm sorry, it obviously has become an open window for the fishers in the region. I mean, not all of them, of course, but some of them will have to be faced between this problem of having a restriction to their economic activity, which is mainly fishery. So if they can't go out fish in the upper Gulf of California and they're being offered with its other side, the part of illegal trade, just fishing or maybe transporting to the border, then it has become something very important in the region because of that. This connection between organized crime and illegal trade of species. And the main country for transit, as I was mentioning, is the US because of this closeness in the border, but also in general for the historic migrations that they have been from China to the U.S., especially from LA part and Mexico, the northern part, which come from many decades ago. Uh, there is a population of Chinese nationals in the U.S. who also participate in this transaction. So, despite strict protections under the U.S. Endangered Species Act, illegal products are still smuggled from the border, sometimes even through internet commerce, which is something very important, as I was mentioning. In the recent years, Interpol has been trying to do these estimates on the amount that is generated through illegal wildlife trafficking, but online trafficking is the main issue in these past few years, because it's very hard to detect. And even though there are efforts, sometimes countries like Mexico lack capacity for intelligence to actually track these kinds of transactions on the internet. So cross-border enforcement and traceability remain limited and reactive in this sense. The U.S. has implemented very strict measures in the borders, and customs are trying to coordinate with Mexican authorities. And sometimes coordination in that sense can be very complicated, because we have this problem that, yes, the Totoaba is its origin is Mexico. So if anything comes out of the country, it implicates a problem in detection from the national authorities. But also, there are a very wide range of modus operandi in this sense. I mean, Totoabas can be transported by land, by sea, by commercial flights. I'd say it's the most common way. Commercial flights are uh, they're mixed with other marine species sometimes, and it's kind of hard to identify for the inspectors and customs agencies, especially because customs are regulate customs try to identify in general illegal products that are being transported, but sometimes they don't have the expertise to know that it's a protected species. And that's why it needs to be also environmental authorities present. I mean, it depends on each country how if they have a division for this. But in Mexico, like I was mentioning, there's a federal attorney's office for environmental protection which specializes on this. They're the ones that can actually tell when it's a protected species, and in our case, customs sometimes can't do that. And the problem also in Mexico, in the borders, when customs are regulating these kinds of things, is that customs are present most of the time. I mean, there are places when they're 24/7, but the Federal Attorney's Office for Environmental Protection is not. So that's a bit of a problem, because in these few lapses of hours, when there's no environmental authority specialized in protected species present, then it can slide something through the customs. And I mean, it's really an imperative problem. I mean, it's basically a human resources problem, because we can't have people on the customs all the time if this office doesn't really have the personnel for that. So that's a bit of the role of the U.S. They do have very strict measures on customs by air, by land, by sea. They have identified a few hotspots for illegal trade, which is mainly the main airports. I mean, LA, the main airports with connection to China. So the main destination country, as I was mentioning, the Totoaba is very consumed in Asia, or I wouldn't say very, because yes, they are trying to implement measures to diminish this consumption, but Asia would be the main destination country. The main demand comes from this region, and particularly from China and a bit from Hong Kong and other countries. There has been detected Vietnam, Japan, but I'll focus more on China in this case, because the trilateral cooperation has been established between the U.S., Mexico, and particularly China. So, although laws in China were strengthened in 2017, high demand driven by traditional medicine and speculation persists in China. The uses for the Totoaba swim bladder, which is the most demanded thing in China, it's the swim bladder. I mean, in Mexico, it can be consumed, as I said, legally through these management units, the meat of the totoaba, and it's prepared in dishes, and I mean it can be even considered in some restaurants as gourmet cuisine. But in China, the main interest is the totoaba swim bladder, because of traditional beliefs that this can be good for certain medical things, but also because as it is a very valued item in the illegal market. Also, it is used for speculation. It is used for exchanging other illegal products, such as guns, drugs, and also this is something that it has been trying to be reduced by the Chinese authorities, as I was mentioning, but it's very hard to track because China has a wide market of wildlife uh, illegal trade. So it's just something that also has to be addressed from the sense that it's part of a culture of believing on this traditional medicine, and this just like part of cuisine, I would say, even somehow, because also traditional, like mm, this how to say this historical part cannot just be addressed by prohibiting something. I think it goes partly in the part that each measure that implements Mexico, the US, and China has to be tailored to their own history, to their own uh, reasons of why the population is participating on this. Why is, as I was saying, the communities of the Upper Gulf of California being involved in Totoaba illegal trade? Well, it has to do with these economic reasons, with the restrictions to fisheries. Why does population in the U.S. participate? Well, they're mainly the Chinese populations that are in the U.S. Participating in these illegal networks, but also, I mean, sometimes other kinds of nationals participating on this from the U.S. So it has a bit of a different reason. But yeah, Mexico and China do have very particular motives to get involved in this sense. I mean, you're different. China, like as I was saying, it has to do more with a cultural thing. But yeah, authorities in China have been implementing very hard measures, trying to reduce wildlife consumption and trying to just spread awareness on the issues of consuming these kinds of items, because actually China got interested in Totoaba swim bladder consumption because the same beliefs of traditional medicine were put before into another Chinese species that is very similar to Totoaba, which is the bahaba, but it got very reduced, the amount of specimens of the bahaba, because of this excessive consumption. So when when they discovered that Totoaba swim bladder had similar um, characteristics and to them probably similar properties, it was when it switched the interest to this Mexican species. So the part of this illegal trade, as I was mentioning, it can be by land, it can be by air, it can be by sea. So the upper Gulf of California is this part that is in red right here, like in the arm of Mexico, between the arm and the rest of Mexico. That sea is the Sea of Cortez. It is also known like that. So the upper Gulf of California, as I was mentioning, it has very restrictive areas, and it is also regulated by another conventions. So implementing measures have been very strict in this area. But when Totoaba swim bladders became illegally traded, it can go just from the border by land, crossing the border, normally going to LA, as I was mentioning, to Asia, to different countries of Asia, Japan, um, South Korea, Hong Kong, and China, as I was mentioning, were the most common destinations, especially the Guangdong province in China. Some seizures have also been detected in Vietnam, but yeah, it focuses on this part of Asia. And trafficking routes can be complex because sometimes it's not just by land crossing the border to the US. Sometimes from this northern part of Mexico, they go all the way to Mexico City because the airport has multiple routes, or it's not marked on this map in particular, but it has also been identified some seizures in this part, which is the peninsula of Mexico, because it also has a very big airport uh, with international destinations, and that's how it all arrives to different parts of the United States, not just the border again, LA, but sometimes it can go all the way up to here to the northern part of the US, to New York, with also a very big airport. And then sometimes it can pass through intermediary countries. Sometimes this is just to avoid authorities' regulation controls, which can be a bit stricter, for example, a bit more strict, for example, to say in Europe than in South America. There have been not many seizures detected in South America, but for example, I remember one in Puerto Rico. I remember one that passed through Panama. So yeah, sometimes they can go all the way to South America and then back to the US and then now to Asia. So routes can be routes can be complicated, and normally people involved in illegal trade try to switch the routes to really to avoid detection, because I mean the authorities have been trying to trace in Mexico. They're not really very focused or specialized knowledge on this part. But, yeah, there have been efforts to look at main points for reinforce or to strengthen inspection surveillance in this airports or land sites for inspections, or in the certain ports of entry and exit. So legal trade is complicated like any other trafficking routes that are developed. So what this really means is that it requires a very strong coordination among authorities, because sometimes a seizure can be made in the US or can be made in China, and it's kind of hard to get back that information. I mean, it should be, and normally it doesn't really come that information to the Mexican authorities. So the channels for communication, of course, are not the most efficient, and that it can take time doing it through official channels, but it's a very sensitive topic, so information does have to be and made through those channels. But for that, I think the societies proposes to establish trilateral cooperation mechanisms, and especially a trilateral group of contact between US, Mexico, and China. It is the perfect space to strengthen this collaboration and make coordinated communication more efficient between these countries, because it is something that can be done in a private way for the states to protect my information and not to endanger any investigations on this matter. So yeah, I've been telling you about this trafficking, and this have been my main observations from public news from 2013 to 2023. I picked those particular years, I mean decade, because I was saying in 2013, around 2012, 2013, organized crime in the strengthened. So it's when illegal trade of Totoaba was going on from decades ago. I mean, at least in the 70s, also it deepened this problematic. But in 2020, I mean, in 2012, 2013, it was when this combination of strengthening organized and growing demand from that happened. It created a very uh, it created an atmosphere for this problematic. So that's the year of start in 2023. Like my data copy analysis for saying it somehow, because it is the year when Mexico presented for the first time the results of the action plan requested by the states. So it was a more in-depth analysis of the measures in prevent. So measures identified during this time would be in the country, which is in, the ones that are especially in rural California, which are Baja California, Sonora, Sinaloa, and also Mexico State's this airport thing that I was mentioning. It's um, it's a very wide possibilities from Mexico's airport to go. I mean, it can go to the US, it can go to a different route in as an intermediary country to get to Asia. And the transit in the US, likewise, border points mainly Nobles, Miami, California, and destinations in China, Guangdong Province, Hong Kong, Vietnam, and Thailand. Trafficking methods in the airports in Mexico City. Sometimes this travel to in I mean in the back in the luggage. Sorry, in the luggage mixed with clothes, mixed with other marine species, and the main way to transport this is dry, in the dry form, because the Travis swim bladder can be transported. I mean, in a fresh state, in a dehydrated state, and sometimes frozen. But in airports, it doesn't really. It's not really transported frozen. That's mainly by land. So in airports, it's mainly in the fresh state and dehydrated or dry. And normally it is transported dry because it has a very strong smell, as they say, and the smell diminishes when that would be the most common way of filling the Totoaba swim ladders. And by land, in the border crossings to Nogales, Mexicali, El Centinela, Ojos Negros. Those are points where it's the border crossing, and it by land it can be transported fresh, dehydrated, and frozen. Frozen as I don't know. Sometimes they say it's part of products that they're selling, so it is mixed with other fishes from. Sometimes they try to do this on purpose, of course, to make identification more difficult, and they transport it frozen, saying it's part of a product we sell, but it is mixed with species from the same family or that have very small swim bladder. So it has become hard to for the inspection because it is frozen. They can't really demand the charge to be unfrozen because there's no guarantee that there's actually a protected species there, and it can imply problems because you can damage a product without actually knowing or having a very strong reasons to believe that there can be protected species hidden in there. So let's say that sometimes they can go undetected. Most occur with Mexican territory. So yeah, the borders are very hard to identify. They can go through so many ways, very different. So it can occur here normally before reaching national borders. Mexico and the US serve as key origin and transit hubs. Trafficking is closely tied to other criminal activities, including arms and drug trafficking. Some implications for law enforcement in the sense that enhanced surveillance is needed at airports and military checkpoints. But as I said, it really needs this perspective of endangered species, because if you don't have then the environmental authority have expertise in this, then even there can be other kinds of ways, and they are going to need someone specialized to confirm that it is a Totoaba swim bladder. So where international coordination is essential along this, and being preferred exit points can help focus attention and inspection efforts. Yeah, so this does require intelligence work, but also I like to mention here that an area that's also very important for any trafficking, but in particular for this, I like to mention is the financial flows. I mean, the identification of the financial flows, because any illegal trafficking needs, makes profits, and it needs an undetected path or where that cash flow goes to. So financial flows are something that's very hard to track in this sense, but it's an important part to identify not just the people that are detected and the seizures. I mean, those can be sometimes intermediary people, so it's not really who leads these kinds of activities. So, as in any trafficking, I think the most important part is to identify key actors. Yes, strategic routes, but routes can change. So, key actors, key enterprises are really what can tell you more when routes change or when methods change. So yeah, and that requires very strong collaboration, because it's a wide range of actors from 3 different countries. And yeah, here's a map that I think I should have put it sooner so you could have a picture on where it's located. But yes, as I was mentioning, it's between this little arm that Mexico has. That's the Gulf of California. This would be the northern part of the Gulf of California, which is the region that we've been talking about. And as I was mentioning, it has different restrictive areas, from less restrictive to more restrictive areas. This little square that you can see that here is the most restricted area in the upper Gulf of California, which is the zero tolerance area. In the zero tolerance area, it is not allowed to navigate, not to fish, not to do any activity, because it's where authorities have been detecting the most presence of these very few specimens of vaquitas that are left. So the National Commission for Natural Protected Areas, which is the Mexican authority in charge of doing annual monitoring in this region, and in particularly to detect the amount of specimens of vaquitas left, has identified that the vaquita is a very delicate species, in the sense that even noise can be a factor for them. So no navigation can be allowed, and that's problematic in the sense that fishers in the region say that most of the biodiversity or the productive the productive potential in the region focuses near this zero tolerance area, or perhaps even in the same zero tolerance area. So they do request less restrictive measures, not in the zero tolerance area, because I mean the communities are well aware of this problematic of vaquita being very near to extinction, but in the adjacent areas they request less restrictive measures. But it's complicated for the authorities also to agree to this, because I mean, opening just a little bit the restrictions can also open the chance for illegal trade. So yeah, historically, the upper Gulf of California has supported key fishing economies shaped by early 20th century Chinese migration, and more recently impacted by organized crime linked to illegal Totoaba trade involving intermediaries from China, the U.S. So this activity concentrates in communities like San Felipe, Puerto Peñasco, and the Gulf of Santa Clara. These would be the main communities requesting these less restrictive measures um, for for their economic activities. And I mean, in past years, the communities had economic incentives from the government to not go out fishing during the restrictive periods. So that was very helpful for them, and that's what they would like to see if they can, if it's something that the government could do for them again. But I mean, budgeting has been changing in the past few years, and in recent years, the alternatives that the path that the authorities are trying to trying to look for is not really economic incentives, but more trying to give them alternative solutions to the fisheries, trying to design more sustainable fishery gill nets. So it's a process that has been doing that the authorities have done, consulting the communities to see their perspective, because I mean at the end it's the activity they have been doing for decades, so they would be the most expert people to know if this gillnets can work or not. And the fishers have expressed that yes, they can be used as new gillnets that are being developed, but at the same time they don't have the same uh, capacity for production as a regular gillnet, like the ones that are prohibited within these regulations to protect the vaquita, because they're more the traditional gillnets are more aggressive in that sense, not just to the vaquita but also to other species. So that's also an interesting point on how to make more sustainable arts for fishery, more sustainable gillnets. And it raises up the question that if fishery is or can be a sustainable activity on itself, um, it depends on a lot of factors. I mean, it depends on the technology that you can use to make it more sustainable, and also the perhaps to make fishery more sustainable, it does imply a reduction on the amount that can be fished in general. So these communities do face some important challenges in the region, because even if they could fish less, or even if they could receive government incentives, it might not be enough, because in the past they could export their products to, for example, the US, and that's how they could get a better profit than by selling them nationally. But because of this problematic of the vaquita and the totoaba, the US has imposed different measures to Mexico, and one of them is that the US cannot buy um, products imported from the upper Gulf of California as one of the measures. I think that's since 2018. So they they do they do have expressed this, that they could make more profits by exporting to the US as they used to, but these restrictions cannot be or won't be lifted by the US unless the the problematic of the illegal Totoaba trade is addressed, and it can be diminished. So environmental degradation in this area has deepened since the mid 20th century due to dam infrastructure on the Colorado River, which reduced water flow and harmed the delta system. Overfishing and habit loss led to the decline of the Totoaba population starting in 1940s. So yeah, it is also a problem that has to do with infrastructure and the construction of dams, and those part in this part has been detrimental to the life in the region for these species. So it does also require some measures to protect the sea environment in this part, in particular, because of how much diversity it concentrates. Chinese migration to the upper Gulf of California brought cultural and gastronomic practices, including demand for swim bladders from species like bahaba, this Chinese species, like I mentioned. And once they were depleted, Totoaba swim bladders became the sought after substitute for traditional medicine, luxury gifts, and culinary uses. This increased substantially the price of Totoaba, making it also known as the cocaine of the sea. Despite the Totoaba fishing ban, the high black market value has driven many fisheries facing economic hardship from permitting and seasonal fishing restrictions into a difficult choice. Um, these are some pictures of the communities: San Felipe, the Gulf of Santa Clara, and Puerto Peñasco. And as you can see, it is a very beautiful area, with, I mean, beautiful landscapes, mainly from the sea. And I mean, it's open to tourism, it's open to other economic activities, but fishery remains the main one in the region. So the fact that these restrictions have been affecting um, socioeconomically the region, since it has been deepened by the US embargo, the gillnet ban, does really make it more complicated for the communities to continue with their efforts to preserve the species in the region. Because I mean, I think by being their main activity and by being something that they've been surrounded their entire lives, they are well aware of the importance of conservation efforts, and the communities participate on these conservation efforts. But it's it's complicated when it's mixed with also uh, their substantial activity. So yes, I've been talking a bit about the U.S. connection, and here I just like to mention that these high-profile seizures and criminal cases demonstrate the role of the U.S. territory in the trafficking chain, especially in the points most often used by the smugglers: Calexico, San Diego, LA, to conceal and re-export swim bladders to China. In the US, the main authorities involved in this sense would be a CBP for borders, and the US Fish and Wildlife Service, as a CITES authority, actually, and that has within their divisions the scientific authority and the law enforcement focal point. Yeah, so consumption in China: high demand by cultural drivers, primary destination market for illegal Totoaba swim ladders, very highly valued because it's viewed as the luxury gift, and it is a symbol of, in some circles, of wealth and status because of their price of the Totoaba swim bladders and the difficulty to get these items. So I think it's something important that links to what I was mentioning at the beginning on the how to value species, because it becomes interesting when something that is not supposed to be a product becomes a product, and a symbol of something like wealth and status, because then it makes you wonder, it makes you ask yourself, how can nature get to this point? How are normal products, for saying, somehow not enough for the economic system, that then it has to switch, until it has to switch to even harder species to get every time, and something more rare, and something more precious, and something more scarce, for saying it somehow, something closer to extinction, that increases the value in the market. So the economic logic behind is very controversial. And yeah, illegal trade networks and laundering practices. Totoaba bladders are trafficked through well-organized networks, often involving Chinese nationals operating in Mexico, who arrange collection and transport to the US and onward to China. So the networks of organized crime are very complex because they can work as enterprises. I mean, they can have the same administration, or not the same, but similar administration methods, and um, the logic behind it is similar to an enterprise. So it becomes hard for the authorities to deal with this illegal trade, because sometimes organized crime networks have more intelligence, more sophisticated guns, more resources than the federal budget on itself. So yeah, it is a limitation for the authorities to deal with this kind of illegal trade.
Hey, I'm so sorry. I'm gonna need to interrupt you because we've actually almost run out of time. So if you just wanna maybe close it up because we have our next presentation on. So sorry to interrupt you for that, but
No, thank you so much to let me know. I really appreciate it. I'm about to close because I think
okay,
we've
perfect.
addressed the main issues. And so, yeah, basically, the weaknesses in this national enforcement are very related to this, to the limitations on the budget, to limitations on the operational staff that can be deployed in the main points. That's the case for Mexico. I would say the case for the US, it's more on coordination and communication, also with the national Mexican authorities for enhanced bilateral collaboration. And on China, the anti-consumption initiatives are something that need to be strengthened, and of course, it needs to be a continued effort to achieve a long-lasting impact. And the fall on the judicial cases with Mexico, it's also very important. Sometimes the procedure continues in China, but we don't really know what happens from the Mexico side with these nationals that have been identified and that are facing a procedure in China. This can be addressed, like I said, in the trilateral enforcement contact group demanded by the CITES. It's a very good initiative, and it could represent something very good for collaboration. So it can facilitate information sharing, protecting the sensitive data that can be exchanged between these countries. But it's something that needs to be again a continued effort, and political tensions sometimes are not particularly helpful, but it is a very good space that has been created and that is beginning to operate. So for better strategies, so I've been mentioning coordination, that's key, sharing information, and also understanding that each country comes from a different place with different capacities, and the reasons behind participation in this illegal trade are also particular to each of these three countries.
Thank
So
you.
yeah, that would be basically my conclusions. I think I've been going into every one of these aspects through the whole presentation. So I would just like to finish uh, it, highlighting again the importance of wildlife species for the biological environment. Everything is part of a chain. So extinction is never good in the sense that it alters ecosystems, and it's something that we can't go back after a species is extinct. That's why it is worth to implement all the measures and, yes, all the resources that it can be also linked for these protective measures. So yeah, that would be everything from my side. Thank you so much for having the chance to share this with you today, and I'm really looking forward to hear the next presentation.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
very much, Sigrid, and thank you for this fascinating and eye-opening presentation of wildlife crimes. I think we do not have any time for questions and comments.
Yeah. I think maybe because I have some questions, and maybe some other people here, we can send you an email with our questions.
Yeah, if anyone has questions,
Yeah.
please reach out to Embrace the Earth and we'll pass on the questions, and then I'm sure we'll get the answers to you like that.
Thank you so much, Sigrid. It was a
Thank-
beautiful presentation and a sad case.
And I invite everybody to stay with us because the program is going to continue with
Yeah.
the presentation. So thanks
Okay.
for that. Bye.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Bye.